content. So let me just share my screen here. Okay, should be able to see my screen now. So in terms of upcoming assignments, we have that quiz for 2 points that's due in a couple of days, end of Friday. And then the contribution proposals after that, which will do the presentations in week 5, and the assignment on process discovery on April 5th. Regarding the assignment to teams, you may have seen my announcement already. So we have a little Google sheet that's linked in the announcement where I'm already assigning everybody who has signed up to be in a particular group. There are still a couple of people at the, well, not a couple, about 20 people at the bottom of the spreadsheet that did not pick a team. So now that everybody had a chance to look at the spreadsheet, and I've corrected a few things already that people have messaged me overnight, I'll start assigning the remaining people into groups that don't have enough members yet, or into their own groups in some cases. So there are some groups that are still a bit on the small side. Like group 1 has 3 people, group 2 has 2 people. So those are sort of obvious candidates where I'll add a few more people. And then if I have some left over, then I will probably have a team 16 or 17 as well. So if you did fill out the survey and haven't double checked the spreadsheet yet to make sure that all the student IDs look correct, please go ahead and do that and let me know if there are any issues. Okay, that's all I wanted to say about that, unless there are any specific questions. The other thing that I did want to cover this morning, and we have a visitor for that, is the announcement regarding the call for participants and the $80 voucher that you can get out of SPI this year for your Slack participation. And I think I saw Rita in the room already. Let me just stop my share here. Hi, Rita.
Hi. Hello, everyone.
So if you're comfortable, just go ahead and tell people what they need to do and what they can get in return.
Yeah. So we are conducting a study in this course, and that announcement was already sent. That's what Christoph was showing. And so the great thing about this study is that there's minimal effort on your part. We're collecting what you're already doing for your for this course, which is collecting your communication in your group work. So the effort that's involved in this is really minimal. And the like Christoph said, there is a voucher, so minimal effort and huge payoff with this voucher. This work is really unique because this type of research has really been done only in industry, looking at people talking and communicating in industry. And I believe this is the first time that we're looking at it through this lens in education. So getting you involved in this is really going to help. And we do have one student researcher here. We've got two students that are on this. Ariana Pierce is one of the researchers. So I don't know if you have questions for us on this study, or if you don't want to ask here, you can certainly send us an email to ask questions.
I'll add my email into the chat if anyone wants to send me any questions.
Okay, Ben has a question in the chat. Did you see?
So Ben, we're right now. So yes, the research is looking at communication and looking at any language associated with gender bias. And it's not that we're specifically hunting out that language in people's communication. We just want to see how people are communicating. And at times, there are implicit language that comes out in that. So, for example, there was a recent article that was posted by the New York Times on an editorial where somebody was giving Dr. Jill Biden, the new president's, the first lady, giving her a hard time about wanting to be called doctor. And the language in that article had a lot of implicit gender bias language. And so those types of things we're going to be looking at, because when you're in a room at times, that can be feel a bit non-inclusive for certain people. And it's not something that we're specifically hunting out. If we don't see any, great. That's something that we can report. But it's just for the study, just collecting what you would normally communicate during your group work. Did that answer your question, Ben?
Yeah.
I was briefly thinking about sharing the link to that Wall Street Journal article here, but then I figured it's probably a good idea not to further distribute that. It's already gotten way too much attention.
Or
Terrible.
A few years ago, the Google Manifesto, where he said that women were not built to be programmers like men. And I think it was like 11-page manifesto on that. And so, yes, thank you for posting that.
Okay.
So for groups to sign up to that, you can contact me by email. That's probably the best way. Because we're just finalizing the team allocation now, it kind of makes sense that this hasn't happened yet. But as soon as the teams are finalized, then I should be able to do that today, because now we have all the people who wanted to be in specific teams should be signed up, and now it's just a matter of filling up the teams with people who didn't have strong opinions about this. So then you can have a quick chat in your team whether it makes sense to sign up for that. I guess, Rita, does it only make sense if the whole team signs up, or could you have one member in a team sign up and the rest not?
Well, if the one person wants to act on behalf of the whole team, saying yes, the team we would like to participate, then that's fine. Then we have your spreadsheet here to go in and contact every member on that team. There's a question here. Could you please brief on what exactly would be your contribution? So what you're doing right now, because this is the first time that we're doing this in education, your contribution is to identify the language that's raised in the group collaboration. And so your work is going to start this framework on how the teams are collaborating. And another question, can we mail preferred language?
I think that's for me. I'm responding by chat, but the next one's for you.
Okay. If the team is female only, that's fine too. It's because women also have implicit gender bias as well. It's not, if you're thinking that this is a male thing, it's not. Language is also something that both genders have. So we're not just looking at the one particular gender. So that might actually be interesting too, if it was just a female only one.
Any other questions for Rita or Ariane while they are still with us? I'm responding to the other question via chat. So yeah, I guess once the teams are finalized, which will happen later today, then maybe just have a quick chat in your team, whether every member gets the $80 certificate Good. Okay. Whether you
That would be rude to share it amongst I see a couple of really large teams, which I'm really quite excited about, to see teams this big, especially working together in education in this environment. Yeah, that would be quite rude to share an $80 voucher across a team that large, but no, everybody receives their own.
Excellent. And the Slack link, I guess you guys can say something to that as well, Rita and Ariane. So I think you've been adding people already.
So I've been trying to add people to the Slack channel, me and the other student researcher yesterday. At the moment, it's the same Slack channel for this experiment as it is for the overall software process improvement course. We haven't been able to send out all of the invites yet because there's a maximum number of invites we can have pending at any time. So if people would be open to accepting their invites later today, that would mean we could send out more invites to people. Thanks.
This should, from the student's perspective, this will all happen automatically in the background. You should be getting emails that will invite you to a Slack instance. If you have gotten that email already, please go ahead and accept. As you know, Slack communication will be part of the assessment. So you will be assessed based on the team communication there, no matter whether you participate in this study or not. So you should accept that invite anyway. Any other questions for our visitors? It is early in the morning.
A lot of the courses seem early this semester.
That's a good question. I have like 2 9 a.m.s this semester. Yeah. It's too many. All right. I'll probably do another reminder for this in the next lecture on Monday.
Yeah, I appreciate everybody's time, and I think this would be a huge contribution, both to the research community and also to just students, education in general, making sure that we provide an inclusive environment for everyone. But we need a starting point, and this is the starting point to that conversation.
I know some of the students in the room are also taking the research methods course this semester, so this would be an opportunity to see research firsthand in action.
Yeah, well, we can certainly walk you through some of that too, what we're doing. And this is the qualitative part of this is something that's not very common, I think, in computer science. But because we bring in a human aspect into it, we bring in more qualitative stuff. So we can certainly, people have questions about that, more than happy to talk about that with students.
I'd get you to do a short visit to the research methods course and then open it up to everybody in here as well, if they're interested.
Yeah, we can use this as the example so that people people can actually see under the hood what's going on if they're interested in how we're looking at their data. How would we define gender biased language? So there's really two types. There's implicit and there's explicit language, where the one of the most obvious ways, and I don't think that this is something that that a lot of people do this way, but to explain it, is that there is a certain assumption that a certain gender performs a certain role. So women are thought of being nurturing or take responsibility of the household. And so when that kind of stuff comes into the communication, that is a gender bias language. We talked about earlier the Dr. Jill Biden article. He immediately assumed that she should drop the Dr. Jill Biden and instead just be called First Lady, because that was her job, to be the First Lady and not be an educator. I think she teaches at the community college level in the States. So that type of assumptions of what people's roles are. That's what gendered bias language looks like.
Another
That's something-
example? Oh, sorry.
Sorry, you go.
Another example that we'll be looking for is to give an example of something a little bit less obvious. So when people are evaluating women, they tend to use terms which are more about effort, whereas if they're discussing men, they use terms which are more about accomplishment. So we'll be looking for more subtle things like that as well.
I think a difference similar to what Rita was outlining, sort of outside of software development, but something that I've seen in software development is that women either tend to go towards or are pushed to go towards like writing the documentation for a project, for example.
Yeah, they call those pink tasks.
Pink Task, that's a good name.
And so we need to start this conversation. And when I say we, I mean education, the education community. And we don't have that conversation in the education space. People are talking about it in the industry space, but not in education. And so your contribution would be to bring that conversation into education to help us create a more inclusive communication environment, regardless of gender, just that everybody can participate and are communicating in an inclusive way, so that nobody feels excluded from the conversations.
And all of this you can do by just doing things that you would be doing for the course anyway.
Yeah, exactly. It's just however you go about your business and get your work done, and we will be looking at it. But as Christoph said, more than happy to use that as an example in the research methods, as a qualitative aspect.
Well, I'll keep that in mind, and if it happens, then obviously that research methods lecture would be open to everybody from this course as well. All right, any other questions? Both Rita and Ariane's email are in the chat now as well, so feel free to reach out to them directly or message me, and I'm always happy to forward. All right, thank you both for stopping by, especially so early in the morning, and we'll be in touch.
Okay, thank you.
All right,
Bye,
thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you. Good luck for the semester.
And then maybe I'll just answer the other question that was directed at me, I guess. In case you haven't signed up for a project yet and you're one of those, and let me just share my screen again. You're one of those NA students at the end of the spreadsheet here. But if you feel strongly about a particular programming language or that you want to work on a particular project, independent of what team members you work with, the easiest way to just communicate that with me would actually just be to fill in the survey again, just with yourself as team member, and that's it. Actually, I saw one person had done this already, so Team 8, for example, has one person at the moment, but I already know that he, I think in this case, wants to work on JabRef, the Java project. So if you feel strongly about any of these programming languages but don't have team members, feel free to fill in the survey just with yourself as team member and your preferred project. Okay, any questions about any logistical aspects or Rita's visit or anything else that we should talk about before we get into the lecture material today? I don't see anything at the moment. Then if half an hour left. Let's start talking about the Linux kernel then. The reason, how do I make this full screen? There we are. The reason I wanted to talk about the Linux kernel is because it's probably the open source project, one of the biggest, probably the biggest. If you can think of a bigger open source project, let me know. That's probably the biggest open source project. It's been around for a long time. Has obviously had a huge impact, not just on users of Linux, but you would know that it's also, the basis of Mac OS. It's the basis of Android and many other operating systems. In particular, also in the embedded space, and running on the servers that make our universe work these days. So, and it's an open source project, right? So it's an interesting case study. Definitely not your average case study. It's sort of the extreme example in the open source space. The other reason why I think it's a good example is that it started small, like most open source projects. So it wasn't the case like, Microsoft at some point must have decided that we will develop this huge operating system, we'll call it Windows, and we'll, put so many thousand people on this, and, we'll release it next year. They would have had this conversation probably in the early 90s. Linux started like any typical open source project does. It started with an idea from one person who had then started to write a little bit of source code for sort of the main functionality of the operating system, and it grew from there. Okay, but let me go through the slides, which will probably confirm a lot of what I just said. So the Linux kernel is a portable operating system kernel, runs directly on hardware, manages access, and then it includes all these things that typical operating systems include. And some of you will have taken our operating systems course at the school here. So, drivers, network access, file systems, schedulers, memory management, all of that. Who uses it? Well, it's often combined with other open source components, such as things like Ubuntu, that you would put on top of the kernel to actually have something that you can use easily. And it's widely used on supercomputers, servers, embedded devices. So a lot of impact there. Who develops it? The project leader is a guy named Linus Torvalds. You may have heard of him. Apparently not the easiest person to get along with. So it's a bit of an example of, I think last lecture we talked about this benevolent dictator for life that a lot of the big successful open source projects have. So sort of the one person who controls the entire open source project. In his case, I'm not even sure he deserves the word benevolent there necessarily, but definitely dictator in that project. But obviously, a lot of technical skill, and has managed to turn Linux into what it is today. So he's the project leader, and then tens of thousands of developers around the world, as in any really successful open source projects, contribute to it. And this data is fairly old here, but even more than 10 years ago, there were already 5,000 developers from 500 different companies who had made contributions to the Linux kernel just in a time frame of less than 5 years there. These numbers have only increased since then. It's a huge project, fast pace of development. Right, I can't remember when these dates are from exactly, sorry, or when these numbers are from exactly. I know, so the dates of the numbers are from 2018, and they compare to 2005. So that'll give you an idea of how much activity has happened. So we have, by now probably 1 million Git commits just in the last, 16 years. In that case, there were, within the span of just over 2 months, 15,000 Git commits, 25 million lines of code, and at that time support for 30 different architectures, including things like PowerPC, ARM, x86 and so on. So these are all, the architecture that's form the base of things like supercomputers or embedded systems. So from very small to very large, really. Anyway, point of this slide is just to say that, this is huge, and it's not the kind of project that you can look at it on GitHub and be like, okay, now I understand everything. 25 million lines of source code is a lot. Why does Linux work so well? Why has it become as successful as it is? One of the core pieces is a modular architecture. Components can be included, excluded at build time, which can particularly explain its success sort of both in the supercomputer and in the embedded space, right? As you can imagine, in the embedded space, you need fewer components. You want as little as possible. You just want to make sure that your little sensor doesn't try to do two things at the same time. So you want to make sure the scheduling works and the network functionality works so that your sensor can send some data, but that's basically all you want on an embedded device because you don't have a lot of memory to work with. Whereas on a supercomputer, obviously you can think a lot bigger, and job scheduling becomes a huge task, for example. And based on the Linux kernel, then you can add all these different modules. Right, it also scales, and that's of course become more and more important with high performance computing centers as well. It scales from just one laptop with one CPU to thousands, all based on the same architecture. It has quite a few nice features, such as journaling file systems, logical volume management, extensive network filtering support, which of course is important, especially to defend against attacks. And it's easy to extend. And as you can tell from Mac OS being built on top of it, Android being built on top of it, big companies have found it easy to extend as well, and reliable enough to do that. And more important, and maybe not more importantly, but also importantly, and for many of us, this might have been the first time we encounter Linux, is that it's free. So if you get a new machine and it has Linux on it, it's usually a bit cheaper than if somebody also needed to pay Microsoft for the license for Windows or Apple for the license of Mac OS. This is kind of a nice historical artifact here. This is how Linux started with. Well, back in the day, we talked about this last lecture, open source relied on mailing lists a lot. So, of course, Linux also started as a mailing list announcement. This was in 1991, 30 years ago. And it's a message from Linus Torvalds. Let me see what the chat message is asking about. Strictly speaking, macOS is Unix-like, that's right, yeah. I would have to look up exactly again what is the relationship between Linux and Unix. If somebody knows, feel free to drop it in the chat. Otherwise, I'll look it up and post it after the lecture. As part of the complex infrastructure of Linux, sometimes it's hard to keep track of what exactly the relationship is. So yeah, this was the first mailing list announcement by Linus Torvalds at the time. Hello everybody out there, I'm doing a free operating system, just a hobby, won't be big and professional like GNU for, at the time 386 and 486 clones. This has been brewing since April, starting to get ready. I'd like any feedback on things that people like or dislike, as my operating system resembles somewhat Minix, which was a system at the time. It's free of any of that code from the previous system. It is not portable, and it probably will never support anything other than AT hard disks, as that's all I have. Well, that turned out not to be true. It ended up supporting a lot of things. And see, I think there was another chat message. I think Linux copies Unix. I think that's to some extent true. Yeah, I'll look up the relationship between Linux and Unix again to not give you any wrong information here. Anyway, what you can see from this announcement here is that, initially it was not planned to be nearly as big as it became. It was not intended to support any architectures other than what Linus Torvalds had at home at the time. And it was announced via a mailing list, like a lot of open source related information at that time. So yeah, it started as a hobby project, just one maintainer. It was hosted on a university server. It had a very simplistic copyright notice that's gotten more complicated since then. But a core piece of open source at the time was that it was prohibiting charging any fees for copies, not even handling costs. So it was already not just saying that, I won't charge for it, but other people can also not charge for it. And they did not have any grand plans, or he did not have any grand plans at that time. Why did it succeed? Well, it was immediately useful. It was something that people needed at the time. It was sort of the time when hardware got a lot more diverse. So people focused more on operating systems that would just work on different kinds of hardware. The code at the time was still small enough to understand. It was about 10,000 lines of C code. It was free, and it didn't have any legal implications, right? You kind of knew that if you made a contribution to it, or if you used it on your own machine, you wouldn't get into any legal trouble, which at the time with commercial software wasn't always as clear. Right. Then over the next few years, the community kept growing. Over 100 developers sort of 2 years into it. And at the time, they released the code via these zip files, tar files specifically, which for some reason seem to be more common on Linux. Sorry. Frequent releases every couple of weeks, so that's always a good way to keep people interested. And the diff from previous version was also provided, so you could always see what does this new version do that the old version didn't do. Of course, commercial software companies also try to do that, right? If you get a new version of Windows, they usually have a nice little file to go with it that tells you all the things that are new. But the nice thing with open source is because the source code's available, you can actually verify these things yourself, and you can see what has actually changed. And as we talked about last lecture, I think on Monday, it sort of used the typical mailing list format at the time, where different people would send their patches or their changes via email, and if you were lucky, then Linus Torvalds would find it interesting and integrate it into his main copy of Linux at the time. It kept growing in size fairly quickly. So in 94 it had like nearly 200,000 lines. 96 were approaching 1 million lines slowly. They had a particular version numbering system. So I mentioned earlier, right? They released fairly regularly every few weeks. That was at the time still fairly unusual. Of course, now we all see our phone apps and they get updated every few days. But at the time, that was fairly unusual. A new version of Microsoft Windows would come out every 3-4 years or something like that. Linux was quite different that way, that they would really push out a new version that would work and would have new features every few weeks. And they had this particular version numbering scheme. So if it had an even number at the end, it was a stable release. If it had an odd number, it was sort of a development release that if you didn't know anything about C code, maybe you didn't want to install that one, because there was still some content that was more of prototype nature. Support for multiple architectures, so that was something that Linus Torvalds in 91 predicted would not happen, was then added in 95. support for multiple CPUs already in '96, even though machines with multiple CPUs were probably not that common yet at that time. And by then, Linux had become so big that companies were starting to be interested in it, and they would run it on their servers, and therefore would be very interested to make sure that it continued to be stable, it continued to be maintained. All security issues would be fixed quickly. So IBM at the time had $1 billion investment even before the turn of the millennium. And then ever since then, it has improved in terms of scalability and performance, like most software. It started to exceed the rest, or it has exceeded the rest of the Unix market in 2012. And like I said, I'm going to look up the difference there again. And has then, in this last decade, really taken over the embedded operating system market as well. Because, like I said before, right, if you want to run a little sensor, a tiny camera, that sort of thing, you don't want to run Windows on those because, it's not modular. You can't easily take all the stuff away that you don't need to run a sensor, whereas on Linux you kind of can. Still need to know what you're doing, but at least it's doable. Git, even for those of you who don't use Linux or have never really encountered Linux, you will have encountered Git, written by the same guy, also written by Linus Torvalds. And it was written as a version control system specifically with the intention of using it for the Linux open source project. Of course, has grown into a huge source control management system, by far the biggest at the moment, on its own, then independent of Linux. But yeah, originally, so it was started by the same person, and it was developed with the intention of supporting Linux development specifically, because as you can imagine, once you have hundreds or thousands of developers, mailing lists are probably not the most efficient way of exchanging changes to the source code that you want others to incorporate into their versions. Right, and if you want to look at where the Git version of where the development really happens, git.kernel.org. Who has commit access to this? So we talked about this on Monday a little bit already, that a lot of open source projects, in particular with the pull-based development on GitHub now, nobody except the project founder, leader, whoever they might be, gets commit access directly, but everybody gets the right to submit pull requests, which is of course also something that we want to do as part of this course. So in a sense, only Linus Torvalds can commit to the main repository, because the main repository is sort of his version of the decentralized version control. But at the same time, everybody can create forks and then have their own version of Linux, make changes to it, and hope that maybe Linus Torvalds at some point will want to pull these commits back into his official version of the Linux operating system. Because Linux has become so big, and because Linus Torvalds has strong feelings about how Linux should be developed, he's a bit famous for definitely not accepting contributions from everybody. So I'm glad so far nobody has chosen to make open source contributions to Linux as part of this project, because chances are we would not be successful, and it wouldn't be because the contribution isn't good, but it would be because Linus doesn't know us, and therefore Linus might not like us very much. So there's a whole hierarchy of people involved in making sure that Linux keeps being developed. They're called subsystem maintainers, so there's one person in charge of networking, one in charge of file systems, and so on. Also one in charge of every one of the big architectures. Often it's not just one person, but it's a team. And Linus might eventually pull something from those trusted maintainers. So the first step would be to convince one of those maintainers that the changes that you want to make are actually that good. Having said that, I don't want to discourage anybody from trying to get their patch accepted into the main version of Linux. That would definitely be something to put on your CV. I'm not going to recommend doing it as part of this course, because with all the hierarchies and all the formalities involved, we do not know what the timeline would be, and semester is limited to a few weeks only. Okay, release management, talked about this briefly already. So new releases every few weeks, sort of around 10 weeks. Version numbering we talked about. The 2 weeks following the release are the merge window. That's the time for maintainers to ask Linus to pull their trees. So after a release, then Linus would open it up and say, and say that if you have any interesting changes in the particular subsystem that you're maintaining, then I would be happy to, or I'll at least take a look at them, and might be happy to integrate them. And then shortly after that, that would close, and then the rest is just bug fixes. So that's something that's also pretty common in industry, right? That you have a fairly short time window for feature development. Once you're done with feature development, it's sort of feature freeze, it's often called, where you only accept bug fixes to make sure that the new features are really stable. So you don't want to be developing new features right up to the release date. So in the Linux case, it's fairly extreme that way. The feature window is usually just 2 weeks, and then the rest of a release is stabilizing and bug fixing time, at least in the main repository of Linux. And sort of the smaller releases are the release candidates. There's usually one per week. These tend to be not necessarily super stable, because there might still be bugs in there that somebody's already working on. Stable versus development trees. Each release is maintained for a period of time, at least until the next release. That makes sense. But there are definitely old versions of Linux, and because it is 30 years old, that are not maintained anymore. Right. So chat message. Check. How do the other forks of Linux compare? That's a good question. There has actually been some research on this. So the question is, how do the other forks of Linux compare to the original in terms of popularity, use, and completeness? There are some that are pretty popular. I'm going to see if I can find that research paper after the lecture. There has been some research on this that has actually systematically analyzed sort of what different forks of Linux look like, and how they are different, and how popular they are as well. To the best of my knowledge, it's still the non-forked version, the repository maintained by Linus, that's the most popular though. But yeah, that's a good point. I'll take a look into that. Good question. Right. Communication methods. Linux uses a lot of mailing lists. They have mailing lists for every subsystem, mailing lists for the different architecture maintainers, and so on. So they still rely on mailing lists a lot for communication, basically because that's how they started. And whenever you start with a particular communication mean, it's really hard to switch afterwards. There's an IRC channel as well, and they do have meetings where Linus sort of invites the people that are most useful on a regular basis. Linux as a kernel, Linux distribution. Right. Thank you, Zheng Hao. Sorry, I'm mispronouncing your name there, for the clarification. So yes, that's the right language to use. Linux as the kernel, and the Linux distribution is then a complete operating system that has the Linux kernel under the hood internally. Sorry if I didn't use the language consistently there. So yeah, the Linux kernel has yearly meetings that you can attend if Linus invites you. And I mean, one nice thing about open source in general is that you can usually see who makes contributions and what they contribute. It's easy to see who has made the most contributions to Linux, whose contributions have made the most impact, who's been active in discussions and so on. And that's not just in Linux, but in many open source projects, how you can move into the inner circle of a particular open source project. Right, I mentioned this earlier, so many companies have a huge interest now in the Linux kernel, because they are developing the sensors that run on the Linux kernel, they are developing the supercomputers that run the Linux kernel, or have built other operating systems that incorporate the Linux kernel in one way or another. So a lot of money is changing hands there as well. Now there is the Linux Foundation as well. I can't remember when that was founded, but it's basically just a legal structure to organize the corporate involvement in Linux. And on the slide, you see quite a few company names that are directly linked to the Linux development now. The decision process, okay, code and patches. So that's something that traditionally has definitely happened on mailing lists, and the same model that you see on GitHub now with pull requests. Discussions happen at the mailing list. Discussions happen at the kernel summit, and the final decision on what goes into the Linux kernel and what doesn't is still up to Linus Torvalds. Right, we talked about releases. Just see how many slides do we have left here, because we don't have a lot of time left. Okay, that's good. So of course, Linux has quite any big open source project has policies. So in this case, regarding documentation and coding styles, patch submission guidelines, and so on. How much code review needs to happen for a new patch to be accepted, those sort of things. And in this case, they require a sign off by, so they require somebody else to take responsible and to sign off on a new contribution. As of recently, they did not have a formal code of conduct. I should verify if that's still the case, because code of conducts have been adopted by a lot of open source projects just over the last few years, and I wonder if Linux has been sort of pressured into doing that as well. Probably a good idea, but they were definitely not leading in that regard. Project documentation, this is definitely not just the story of the Linux kernel, it's sort of the story of a lot of software projects, as you will know. Project documentation lives in many separate places, sometimes not all in sync, doesn't always work as well as you think it should, might be out of date. So you have some documentation inside the repository, you have separate projects for the manual pages, there are tons and tons of web pages and books on the Linux kernel, and as you can imagine, particular books tend to get outdated fairly quickly with very limited means of updating them. Right, project roles, that's I think the last content for today. So Linus Torvalds is in charge, effectively also the release manager. Then under that are a bunch of subsystem maintainers, we talked about those. They don't have a formal person who's in charge of tracking all the bugs, maybe just because the project is too big and it makes more sense to track those at the subsystem level. There's also no formal webmaster, but some of the web pages are maintained by the foundation. No formal documentation master, which might explain what we had on the previous slide, that documentation tends to live in many different places. And we have people in charge of the mailing list and also the infrastructure underneath. Okay, it's 10, so we should finish at this point. So the reason that I picked Linux for this case study was that it's it's one of the, or it's probably the biggest open source project out there. And it's sort of an interesting case study of how something developed in the open source community from something very small to something that we're all using on a day-to-day basis, and that had to grow in terms of the governance structures over time as well. Okay, if there are no more questions as of now, then we'll finish at this point. I will look up the Linux versus Unix confusion and post something about that, and I'll also post the lecture recording later. All right, thanks everyone, and
hi Christoph, this is Puneet here.
Yep. Hi Puneet.
So will I be assigned with any teammates or are they doing the project alone?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Yeah, so will I be assigned with any other teammates or would I be doing it alone?
Yeah, no, I'll find more team members. So I left it open until now because I just wanted to make sure I'd captured all the information of people who wanted to work with others correctly. But later today, I'll go through all the people who don't have teams yet, and I'll assign those to teams that have too few members at the moment, and yours is one of those. Because you have one member at the moment, and if there are any left over after that, then they'll form their own team. So yeah, later today you'll have team members.
Okay, can I make a suggestion? Could you please assign team members in the same time zone so it's easier to communicate that way?
I don't think I have an easy way of telling who's in what time zone, unfortunately.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
What I can do is I can leave it open for a couple of days if people want to switch with each other. If there are some pairings that might make more sense based on time zones, I'll be happy to leave it open for a bit and be open to changes there. But I don't think I have access to time zone information.
Yeah. Thanks.
All right. Thanks everyone, and talk to you again. Yeah, more questions.
One more question, Professor. Sure. I just found the Google Excel sheet you sent. The Java project, I think they're all the same, like for the Java project.
Yes, so different teams will pick different tasks within that project.
Oh, that clears it. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions? All right. Thanks, everyone. And I'll see you again on Monday. All right. Bye.
Thank you.